This is the I Read Comic Books podcast. It is the 250th episode of the I Read Comic Books podcast, and I am your host for this momentous occasion, Paul Jasley, filling in for Mike Rappin. I was going to say we should have done a big special oversized issue for episode 250, but every episode of I Read Comic Books is special to me. Aww. So I'm happy to be joined by two great hosts to join me on this 250th episode extravaganza, Kait Lamphere.
Hi.
And Kara Shamborsky.
Hey.
Welcome both. We don't really have an extra oversized special episode. It's just hard not to think of it that way since we're comic book fans. We want 250 episodes or issues, as it were, to be special, but we'll make it special. You know, I think we have an interesting topic. So, before we get into the topic for today, let's start off with the questions I am legally obligated to ask as the host of the podcast. How have you two been? How have comic books been? Let's start with you, Kara.
Well, Paul, you know what? What's that quote? I am just straight up not having a good time right now.
Sure.
That quote feels like my life at the moment. And I'm sorry to start off the special extravaganza episode by being such a downer. But I'm just like, okay, Friday I took the day off from work and I was just feeling like opening a school in a pandemic is overwhelming, and I decided that I needed a little personal time, and one of my friends from the city invited me along for a hike. And I was like, okay, I'm going to take the day off. I'm going to get out of the house. I'm going to be one with nature, and it'll be great. And then I realized half an hour into the hike that I was not physically equipped for this hike because It was straight up a low mountain, and I have been sitting on my couch since March. So my body still hurts. And then afterwards, we went to a restaurant outside, and it was the first time I'd visited a restaurant during the pandemic, and I had inadvertently violated the health code by pulling my chair away from the table because I'm not in the pod of the people that I was with. Right. And so a server came over and explained this to me, and I was like, okay, yeah, but like, can we then move to two other tables? Because we were told at first that we can't that I can't have my own table because there's just one of me. And he was like, that's dumb. Who told you that? Yes, take the other two tables. And then, you know, in a normal level of a restaurant, there's a lot of chatter and a lot of noise, and you don't really feel like you're being overheard. But if you have like a third or a half of your capacity and people are spaced out sitting outside, your voice can carry, which is how I heard this server bitching about me to the other servers and patrons. And I just burst out crying into my french fries, and I was inconsolable. And it was not great. So that just kind of set the tone for my weekend. And like, I have had some nice moments, but overall, like, my body still hurts, and I'm still just like, well, I guess I'm never going to a restaurant again. Thanks for that experience. So I'm delighted to come and join you and talk about comic books instead, so I can forget about reality for a little bit.
Yeah, we're nicer here.
I know, you guys are so nice. Oh man, and to answer your question about how are comic books, Paul, I'm actually gonna hijack Kait so we can do a mini book club.
Yes.
So how are comics? So maybe like a week or two ago on our IRCB group chat, Kate Scotchless was raving about this book that she had read called Mooncakes, and she was like, oh, Kait Lamphere, thank you so much for recommending this book, it's awesome. And Kait Lamphere's like, what? so apparently Scotchless had misunderstood one of Kait Lamphere's previous recommendations, but then it transpired that because Scotchless had found this book and recommended it, Kait Lamphere and I also read Mooncakes and also found it delightful. So we're going to have a mini book club right now where we talk about Mooncakes.
Oh, please do.
So it is by Suzanne Walker and Wendy Xu, and it is about this witch are like long lost childhood friend who's a werewolf comes to town and they have to like exorcise a demon from the woods. And it sounds like it might be a horror story, but it's actually like very charming. And it's just like it's like strong fall vibes. And Kate, were you the person who said this is what you wanted pumpkin heads to be, or was that Scotchless?
I don't know, but I would agree with it, whoever said it.
We're all of them. It's so nice when we find a book where we're all just like, ah, yes, this. Our opinions align.
Yeah, I didn't even notice the fall theme until about halfway through, but yeah, it had like references to I mean, they made up a religion and a holiday for it, but it was basically, yeah, it was a fall celebration that they were celebrating in it, which is with the food Mooncakes, which is what the book is named after, even though it's only mentioned in one scene.
It's so charming, and it draws you in, and you're like, yes, I would like to read a story about lunar pastry. Go on.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Kate, what did you think of the characters when you were reading this book?
Like you, they were all charming. So it's a non-nuclear family that you focus on. The protagonist is being raised by her grandmothers. So it is an LGBT plus book, which is fantastic. It was very cute. There was one friend that was like, I was worried that there was going to become I'm the third link, or the third wheel. But there was none of that. It was great. It was just a very supportive friendship. She showed up when she was needed. She called when she needed them. They were all very supportive of one another. And I
enjoyed immensely that the friend was like, everyone around her is a witch, and she's like, physics.
Yeah. This shouldn't be possible.
I thought that was an excellent contrast. Because, like, realistically, if you... There would be that person where if they discovered that magic is real, they're going to be like, but science, I'm going to make it work.
Yeah. Yeah, I wish that I actually looked up this writer, and I can't really find much else by her. But I'm going to keep an eye out because, yeah, I definitely want more of this kind of story.
Then make more. Make more works, writer.
Well, I'm excited to join the Mooncakes Club. I just looked up some of the artwork, and it looks lovely. Wendy Zhu's artwork looks lovely, and you've made it, sound appealing. So,
oh yeah, I will admit I did not fully see the twist at the end coming, so that was satisfying.
Same.
I enjoyed that the werewolf friend was like. Oh, a friend or a love interest. And I always just really appreciate romantic subplots that don't take over the majority of the plot, if that makes sense. Like, I'm way more interested in, like, an action-adventure story where you see chemistry developing and like, there's some kind of resolution at the end, as opposed to a rom-com where the whole thing is, but they will fall in love. They're attractive people. Of course, this is how it is.
Right.
Yeah, I agree.
I much more enjoy the tension of the reality of like, well, life is not always just about relationships. Sometimes other stuff happens, like a demon in the woods who's terrorizing everybody and all the fine forest folk, and you need to stop it. Also, maybe you will end up with the cute friend. Let's find out. Let's go on this magical adventure together. Here, have a mooncake.
It's that classic story, two people meet, they are attracted to each other, and then have to fight a demon. I mean, it's a tale as old as time, really. Yeah. No, that actually sounds great. I'm glad you both read that, and you've kind of sold me, so I'll have to dig into that and check it out as well. So, cool.
Join the cult.
So, Kate, we know one comic you read. Is there anything else you want to talk about you read this week?
Yeah, I read The Rivers of London, Volume 1 by Ben Aronovich and Andrew Cartmel, with art by Lee Sullivan and Luis Guerrero. And I actually started listening on audiobook to the prose books by Ben Aronovich, and I've been working through those pretty quickly. I assumed that the comic books would be adaptations, so I was trying to read these prose books before I read the comic books, and it turns out that they're just additional stories. So you don't need to read the prose books first.
Okay.
And I think that this would appeal a lot to fans of the Dresden Files. It's a modern urban fantasy with a magic user, male protagonist. It is still a little bit sexist. Like, all of the women are described as to how attractive they are, but they also hold positions of power. Like, every single woman is like a police officer or a leader of the community. And then in comparing it to the Dresden Files, there are way more people of color characters in it. So just, as a reader, that's more of what I want to see in all of my reading. So that's been a really nice change within that genre. And a lot of these comics are on Hoopla. There's I don't know, I want to say almost 10 volumes, and I've only read the first one, but I'm going to keep going with them because, they don't seem to really spoil what's in the prose book, so I think it would be fine if I kept reading the comics without being that far along in the prose number. I
hope you are correct and that you are not ruined.
Yeah, well, some pretty intense stuff happens in the first 2 prose books, and I haven't seen any, even though the characters that those things happen to are referenced, you don't see them and you don't hear about their story. So reading the prose books would just add a layer of extra meaning when that reference happens, but you didn't hear about the terrible thing that happened to them. So hopefully it will not spoil me, but we'll see. I'm gonna keep reading them both the prose and the comics. So
I always find it so interesting when comics are created as a supplement to a prose book. I'm totally blanking on the title, but that happened a few years ago with this YA series about circus performers. I think something like the Tightrope Girl or something like that. And there was a tie-in comic sequel that I read prior to reading the book, and it still worked as a one-shot, but then I went and read the first book and was like, oh, this is good, do more of this. And so I appreciated that. And then, of course, sometimes it doesn't work as seamlessly as you would like. For example, when Brian and I went and read lots of Star Wars, and it turns out that the new Squadron books that tie into the TIE Fighter Squadron comic books don't actually tie in, and that was unsatisfying. But I just find that overall the comic prose complement can work if you actually care to interweave the threads and make it make sense.
Yeah, I think that this would stand alone okay. I mean, like I said, you'll miss one reference, but that's fine. You can just read past it.
I have a very hard time reading books without pictures in them these days, so I'll stick to comics. So yeah.
Yeah, I listen to a lot of audiobooks while I'm doing other things, but sitting down to read a prose book just takes so long.
Well, for me, I unfortunately have let my weekly comic book floppies pile up around my house. When Diamond shut down for the brief month or so there, I was able to catch up on everything. Now we're back up and running more or less at full speed. I'm back in my a bad habit of just letting things pile up and let weeks worth of comics just sit around unread, which is a crime. But I did make some time this week to read 2 graphic novels or OGNs that I was highly, highly anticipatory for. Does that make sense? That were highly anticipated by me. One of which was Jack Kirby, The Epic Life of the King of Comics by Tom Scioli. This is a book, of course, I was going to buy it as soon as it was announced. It's Tom Scioli, who did Transformers vs. G.I. Joes, who did Fantastic Four, Grand Design. One of my favorite artists and writers. Him doing a biography of Jack Kirby, as the title implies. And I can't think of a better artist to tackle Jack Kirby. Scioli's artwork is so influenced by Jack, and his storytelling sensibilities obviously borrows heavily from Jack Kirby's work. This book is really interesting because it is an unauthorized biography. It hasn't been authorized by the Kirby estate. It's not authorized by DC or Marvel. So I was kind of expecting more of a warts and all type of biography, but Scioli plays it pretty straight. The book is essentially narrated by Jack himself, taken from interviews he did over the years and kind of restructured into a narrative sort of explanation of his life. There are a few moments where you get voiceovers, quote unquote, or narrative asides from other people. Like his wife, Roz, has a few moments where she gives her account of the events that happened. Stan Lee shows up to give his accounts of a few things, but overall plays it pretty straight. A lot of stuff I already knew, but what's really interesting about the book is the way Scioli ties everything together. Everything that Jack went through is filtered through his comics. Like his comics were a way for him to understand and express his own life experiences. So the reason Jack Kirby always did comics that featured a gang of kids was because when he was a young boy growing up in Lower East Side, New York in the 1920s, he was in a gang. So it's like, well, I grew up in a gang. That's part of my life. I'm going to make comics about these kid gangs that like fight crime. It's, that was a way of him expressing his life. And then his experiences in World War II were really like harrowing and really shook him and shaped his idea of what humanity is. So that becomes the New Gods, right? And Darkseid becomes an allegory for fascism. So the idea that Jack Kirby's work, as cosmic and big as it is, it's very true to what his life experiences were. So I appreciated that. And you get a sort of shorthand history of comic books as a medium and a business because Kirby worked in comics starting in the 30s. So it's the 30s through the 90s. You get to see firsthand how hard it was for him as an artist to get by and fight against corporate control of comics. So it could be a tragic story, but it ends on a very positive note. We all know what Jack Kirby's legacy is, so it's nice to see it celebrated in a book like this.
Yeah. When did this come out?
It came out just last month. I think just a few weeks ago. So,
I did see something about it. I don't know if you probably shared it with the group or something, but
Sure.
I have seen some stuff about this, so I might, I'll definitely add it to my reading list.
Add to cart.
Yeah.
I will say, I mean, I could nitpick things about it, but I overall really enjoyed it. I think if you're someone who doesn't know that much about Jack Kirby, really, it's very informative. I will say Scioli makes a very specific art choice, and at a certain point in the book, he starts drawing Jack Kirby with big, like, kawaii chibi-style eyes. Like, he draws them, like... And
I see that on the cover, yeah.
Yeah. And it's jarring at first, but there's a reason why he does it. I don't want to spoil my interpretation or give too much into it, but it's like, I think there's a reason he does that, and it's about Jack Kirby's personality. So it is jarring at first, though, to see it. So... Anyway, I highly recommend it, especially if you're not a Jack Kirby fan. You should be, and this will explain why, I guess. So.
Yeah, I mean, Jack Kirby, learning about Jack Kirby was, I guess, a slight turning point in my understanding of mainstream U.S. superhero comics.
Sure. Yeah.
Because, I got into Marvel, like, more in my 20s. As opposed to DC in my teens and my youth. And so my understanding of Marvel up to that point, like cast your mind back, folks, to the like mid 2000s when Stan Lee was making cameos in like that first Fantastic Four movie and like the first Spider-Man movies. And it was like, I was enough of a nerd to know like, that is Stan Lee, the comic book man, but didn't really know anything else about everything else. And like somewhere around Marvel Comics, The Untold Story came out, and I read it like it was the Bible. I was just kind of like, oh my God, Jack Kirby and all these other dudes were wronged. And obviously the legacy is much more complicated than that. But I was like really drawn to this idea of Jack Kirby's art being dynamic and bold and very of the decades that he was drawing it in, and how it really did capture the imagination of all these people who had been reading comic books, but reading comic books in the way of like, here's like, when you're reading a comic book where you can't really tell what the action is supposed to be versus a comic book where the action just flows very fluidly. And Jack Kirby is definitely one of the latter artists. And so I think that was a real moment for U.S. comics where everyone was like, oh, this is exciting. Okay. So I
trust. Yeah.
So I'm always excited when he gets a little more attention, especially in a format that might attract people who maybe aren't reading comic books necessarily.
Right, exactly. And I think I would argue that comic books are the perfect medium to tell his story. His life was so intertwined with the medium, so it makes perfect sense. And like, Yeah, to know more about the man just behind the pictures. It's very easy, I think, to see the finished product and think, oh yeah, someone drew that, but actually think about how much more work goes into that. It's important to reflect on that. And trust me, we could have hours of conversation about Jack Kirby, but that's for another time.
This is now a Jack Kirby appreciation podcast.
Oh, if only. Very briefly, the other book I wanted to mention was Pulp by Ed Brubaker and Sean Phillips, with colors by Jacob Phillips. This is a standalone OGN written by the team that does Criminal and Kill or Be Killed and all those fantastic comics, which I love dearly. Brubaker and Phillips, they're the best. I don't know how else to describe it. I know when I pick up one of their comics, I know what the tone is going to be. I know what it's going to read like, and it's always satisfying. This book is about a writer who's writing Western stories for pulp magazines in the late 30s. He's struggling to get by because the industry, you have the Great Depression on top of the industry being in a slump. His rates get cut. He goes from like 5 cents a word for his stories to 2 cents a word. At the same time, you have the American Nazi movement happening in New York. There are a lot of people sort of promoting Nazism before the war really starts. And that atmosphere lends itself to crime, and that's what Brubaker and Phillips do best. So the writer the book is about, he was an outlaw in the Old West as a young man, and he's kind of falling back into his old ways and decides to maybe go back to his criminality and of his past. So, you know what you're going to get with Brubaker and Phillips. It's going to be about crime. It's going to be about toughness. What's interesting about this book, it's also about the creative process. It's about a writer who's being screwed over by the publisher, right? Much like Jack Kirby. There's a lot of connections between the two books, I think. And I also really enjoyed the way Jacob Phillips used the color in this book. The flashbacks to the Old West sequences are colored in a different style that's subtle at first, but when you notice what he's doing, it's really, really impressive and really jarring. It's a really beautiful looking book. I'm glad that Brubaker and Phillips are kind of doing these more standalone 100-page OGNs as well as their regular, monthly comics. So highly recommend that book as well.
I always feel about Brubaker and Phillips the way I feel about quote unquote good music. Like,
okay, yeah.
Like I am a bubblegum pop trash queen. And so
Sure.
when people play music that is quote unquote good, maybe more indie music or rock from people who are very good at their craft and making excellent things, I listen to it and I understand that it's good, but I don't want to listen to it. And I feel that way with Brubaker and Phillips. I read Fatale.
Yeah.
And something. What was that Golden Age Hollywood one that they did with the murders?
The Fade Out.
Yeah, that one. And it was great, but I really struggled to understand what was going on. I understood that I was reading something good, and I understood that it was very well executed, but I didn't connect with it in the way that I would connect with, for example, Mooncakes. So.
I mean, that's understandable. I find myself sometimes too reading their stuff, and even if reading the stuff month to month, sometimes I lose the thread of the narrative, but I'm always willing to kind of just look at the craft involved, and kind of that's enough to carry me through a lot of the times. Just to see how they're telling the story to me is just as interesting as the story itself. Sometimes even more interesting.
And also, I mean, they're one of the most, we don't throw this word around lightly, but one of the most iconic comic book creator duos working today. Like you said, when you see their names attached to a project, you kind of know more or less what you're getting into. It's kind of like if someone says oh, Kieran Gillen and Jamie McKelvey are doing a project together, and you're like, here is my credit card, thank you.
Yeah, exactly. And to tie the music analogy back into it, I'm just kind of a sucker for that maybe comfort of that. I know every time I buy a Dinosaur Jr. record, it's going to sound more or less the same as the last one, but I kind of like that. I know what I'm going to get. So, yeah. There's something comforting about that, yeah. So maybe that's what I need right now in my life is comfort, and this provided it. A story about crime
you and everybody
Nazis.
Else.
Exactly. So those are the books we read. Let's talk about comics we're excited to read in the very near future. Comics drop this week on Wednesday, the 19th of August. Kara, what are you excited for this week?
Speaking of just wanting to be surrounded by comfort,
right,
which has for sure been my pandemic purchase motivator. Like, I am swimming in tie-dye now and living my best 90s life, even though,
Sure.
you know, I was a child in the 90s and could not fully appreciate that nostalgia. Like, I got a brown lipstick on the way. I am ready. Like, I'm here for this regressing to childhood situation.
Sure.
So when I was looking at comics that are coming out this week, I was really looking for something where I can be like, I don't want to be a grown-up with responsibilities. I want to go back to my youth. And I did find a way to do that with comic books, but with a slight academic twist. So Fantagraphics is a publisher where every time they put something out, I'm like, ooh, I want that. And then I realized I would very quickly go broke. So
Yes.
I don't purchase from them as much as I would ideally want to, but they do exquisite archival collections that are nonetheless affordable. And a series that they are publishing now is the Complete Carl Barks. And Carl Barks is kind of the guy who was creating Disney comic books in the mid-20th century. And the Disney comics are actually still hugely popular in Europe, but we don't really see them in the US, which is honestly a tragedy, because especially some of the Carl Barks work in particular is excellent storytelling. And they're doing a second printing, I believe, of volume 12 of the Complete Carl Barks, and you're like, Kara, volume 12, do I have to read the first 11 volumes? No, friends, it's Disney comic books. They're like one-shot stories, and volume 12 is all about Scrooge McDuck, which, if you are unfamiliar with the character Scrooge McDuck, in which case I will say, get thee to Disney Plus. Scrooge McDuck is essentially a riff off of the famous literary character Ebenezer Scrooge, except he's Donald Duck's uncle, and he's very wealthy and Scottish, and has a lot of adventures relating to his money and being a miser, essentially. But it's Disney, so he's like charming about it in his capitalist way. And so this Complete Carl Barks Volume 12, Scrooge McDuck, features the story Only a Poor Man, which the Fantagraphics solicit on their website describes as the defining Scrooge yarn, and also his first major appearance. So I have this book in my cart now. It's being released on Tuesday, not Wednesday, because it's a book, so I think they're on the book publishing schedule of Tuesdays. But yeah, like Carl Barks is an artist where I understand his work is formative for this time period, but I've just never really dove in too much into it. But I will now change that. What am I doing? I'm at home. I want to pretend to be a youth again. Why don't I just revisit all of these comics that were written for all ages, but with my, more adult critical eye? I can still enjoy it, but I can also be like, look, the storytelling.
Right. Yeah, that Carl Barks is one of those writers or artists that every other comic book writer or artist, every artist cites as an influence. You'd think, like, how can these Duck comics be that influential? But, Jaime Hernandez, Gilbert Hernandez, every artist, I'm sure Jack Kirby was looking at stuff. Steve Ditko was all looking at this stuff, because it's basic cartooning, and he kind of helped define how that functions. So, I've looked at a little bit of it, and like you said, much like Scrooge McDuck diving into his giant vault of coins, I need to dive into more of this stuff to investigate it. So.
Right? There's no better time. What else are you doing?
Exactly. Yeah. So thanks for reminding me of that. I might have to pick that up as well. So.
Right?
All right, Kate, what about you? What are you excited for this week?
I'm excited for something that you've heard about a few times before.
Go on.
Lady Mechanika.
We're all about comfort here.
Yeah, Lady Mechanika Volume 6. Sangre is the subtitle. This is by Joe Benitez, Garcia Chen, and Brian Ching. And I was collecting the single issues in this particular series, but I fizzled out for some reason. And now that it's collected in a volume, I'll have to finish it, but I might check out the collected volume because I've never read a collected volume in this series. And when publishers collect a book, they tend to add extra front matter or rear matter, or at least different stuff than what you would read in the single issues. So I might just grab the whole volume. And I've talked about Lady Mechanika before on this show. She's a woman with mechanical arms, legs, and eyes. She's an investigator badass with a steampunk in a steampunk Victorian era. And if you're interested in reading this, every volume can pretty much stand alone. So if you want to check this out, I do recommend it. Sangre in particular it's got some backstory with like Central American mythology. And so this takes Lady Mechanika to a place that she hasn't been before, which is starting to become a theme in the series, which I'm really enjoying. You gotta, as much as I really like the kind of Victorian London general setting that you get in the first couple of volumes, seeing other parts of the world in this kind of fictional version of the late 1800s is a lot of fun.
I know you've mentioned that series before, and all I can think of is a gender-swapped Victorian Inspector Gadget, which seems right up my alley, so I should really check that stuff out.
Yeah. Yeah, Lady Mechanika is not afraid to punch some bad guys, and it's a lot of fun because she swaps between like a scene where she's all in like this nice ball gown to do some visiting, to ask people questions. It's not a ball gown; it's what they wore in this time period. And then in the next scene, and then the next scene she's in like some like kind of like Black Widow type get up, but with like extra goggles and stuff, so she can, well, she doesn't need the goggles, but like extra like eye coverings and things, because
you're speaking my language,
mechanical
stuff,
eyeballs,
so
she can like see in the dark and stuff.
As fun for me, it's a very small week for my pull list, so this kind of is my pick by default, more or less. It's Wonder Woman Dead Earth #4, the last book in Daniel Warren Johnson's post-apocalyptic Wonder Woman series. It's Daniel Warren Johnson writing it and doing the artwork, with Mike Spicer on colors and Russ Wooten on letters. The appeal for this book is Daniel Warren Johnson's artwork, this in an oversized sort of magazine-sized format, so you get these big pages, big double-page spreads, and it looks lovely. But the last issue, issue 3, I found really sort of disappointing or underwhelming. You find out in that book, because again, it's post-apocalyptic, Wonder Woman's kind of the last hero left, and in issue 3 you find out what happened to Superman, specifically how Superman and Wonder Woman had a falling out, and I won't spoil anything, but what Wonder Woman does feels so wildly out of character that it kind of like really didn't work for me. That said, I'm enjoying the artwork and the visual appeal of the book enough, and it's only 4 issues, so I got to grab the 4th one, I guess. But I'm just hoping that Daniel Warren Johnson will be able to pull out a surprising, satisfying ending, given some very strange, out of characteristic actions from Wonder Woman, the titular character. So it's a mixed bag. It's one of those books that maybe will hold up better on reread, but it's a book I'm just buying simply for the visual aesthetic appeal at this point, I guess.
Is this one of those, like, Wonder Woman not in character things, like when 15-year-old spoilers, she snapped Max Lord's neck, and everyone was like, what? Is that really Wonder Woman? Is it like that level? Or is it more like, oh, DC, you did that thing again, where you're just changing Wonder Woman because that's what you do every decade?
Yeah, no, I guess more of the first, without giving too much away. It's something that it's dramatic and it's shocking, and it feels it's just there to be dramatic and shocking, as opposed to, fitting in the narrative or fitting with the characters. So I don't know. Again, I like Daniel Warren Johnson's artwork enough to kind of maybe overlook that. If nothing else, it'll be a pretty book to read. So. Okay, let's take a very quick break. We'll be back with our topic for this week, which is comics we didn't think we would like. We'll unpack all of that when we come back shortly. I forgot to mention this or neglected to mention this at the top. It is our 250th episode. We would not have 250 episodes if it weren't for the support from our listeners. So I want to say special thank you to all of you who are listening, especially our friends over on Discord. We have a great time talking with all of you, and our Patreon supporters who give us a little bit of their hard-earned money to keep the show running and for bonus episodes. So if you're not on that, be sure to check out our Patreon. We really appreciate it. And again, thank you to everyone. We would talk about comics with each other regardless, but it's nice to know that other people like to listen to us do it. So thanks again for 250 episodes. Hey guys, how about 250 more? How's that sound?
Well, I mean, for sure, at this time when we're all just in our homes, we need this sense of community now more than ever, huh?
Exactly. So yeah, again, I do want to say thank you to everybody for listening. Our topic for this episode is an interesting one. It's kind of a slight contrast to all of the comforting comics we were talking about earlier. We're going to talk about comics we didn't think we would like, but I'm assuming the implication is comics we ended up liking regardless. So the idea of pushing ourselves out of our comfort zone, trying a book that maybe at first glance, looking at the cover or some of the artwork or whatever, we didn't think we would enjoy, but we challenged ourselves, we read it, and we enjoyed it. I had a hard time thinking of stuff, so I'm wondering if either of you two had books that jumped right to the front of your mind when you heard this topic.
Well, I guess it's well, Kate seems much more sure of herself than I am, so Kate, please begin.
So the first thing that jumped to my mind is superhero comics, which might make me a comic book hipster. I'm like, no, I don't want to read those. But I've read a handful of them, 4 different reading challenges or books of the month or a special episode on the podcast or something. And I ended up enjoying Animal Man by Jeff Lemire and Travel Foreman. And I mean, like the red scenes from the DC's The Green, the Red, and the Rot mythology made my skin crawl. And so there were definitely parts in it that were not for me. But in general, I read this 2 years ago and I'm still thinking about it because it was a lot different than I had really gone in expecting. There was a lot more nuance as to like morality, and like the main character wasn't sure of himself quite a bit once you got into past volume 1. And so it kind of broke the expectation of these like larger than life characters that have had their own series or have been seen across multiple books are always sure, always tough, always morally correct, and it just the nuance was really new to me with this kind of book. So I actually might read more inside this DC like creation mythology. I might, in particular, I'm kind of interested in reading the Swamp Thing.
Sure. Yeah.
Especially after watching the show.
Yeah.
Can I just tangent for a moment?
Please.
I just read a book all about fungi. And I'm so sorry to be terrible on titles, but I continue to be terrible on titles. And, but there's like this new book that came out that is all about fungi and how we don't really know a lot about fungi, and we're starting to learn more about fungi. And a big part of this book was talking about how actually scientists have proven that tiny little networks of like microscopic fungi do connect all of the plants, and that plants can actually transfer nutrients and like messages, not in the way that like we send messages, but in like a plant way of sending messages through this network of fungi to other plants. And the whole time I was reading this book, I was like, does DC know that the green is real? Like, it's probably a little more nuanced than they think it is, but holy crap.
Well, science fiction becomes science fact. We've seen it before, so that's interesting. I think
Entangled Life. It's called Entangled Life. It's by, get this, the author's name is Merlin Sheldrake.
Okay, you made that. That's made up. That
no, it's real. And like, who else would be writing a book about fungi and how it connects our entire world?
True.
Well, I'm glad that Merlin found his true calling then, because that sounds like the perfect book for him to write, I guess.
Right.
Well, that's interesting you mentioned that, Kate, because I kind of have a couple thoughts here. Those books are less super heroic, quote unquote, and they're more sort of horror books. They have a different angle to the genre, I think. And I think if you're someone, it's always interesting to me to talk to people who didn't read comics as a kid and weren't into superheroes, because that was my whole experience. So whatever different angle you have to come at superheroes with to kind of find them interesting, I think horror is a kind of a common one. The idea of body horror or having powers or the unknown, like that's a good angle to get into the grand mythology of superheroes.
Yeah, another one that I read that's kind of superhero-y, or I know that Animal Man isn't really like a Batman or Superman or anything like that, but he's like a reoccurring character as far as I know. He at least like has shown up in other books. So
people know who he is.
Yeah. And he's always kind of been, or the past 30 years or so, he's been a character that is sort of written as being slightly outside of all of that. I mean, Grant Morrison's Animal Man run from the late 80s is fantastic because he does take that character and really change it and change your expectations of a superhero comic. So if you want to know more Animal Man, it's not as horrific as the Jeff Lemire Travel Foreman stuff, but it is using Animal Man in a very different way than you do normally use a superhero to tell the story. So
I think part of it's also like so many of the DC heroes in particular are on teams very often, and Animal Man is not generally a character that I think of as being associated with any one particular team. Like his stories are very much his stories and not like Justice Society stories,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, another one that I was kind of surprised by was Under the Moon, a Catwoman tale by Lauren Miracle, and I was thinking Catwoman, and then again, my mind immediately went to how Catwoman interacts with Batman in particular, and like, I don't know if she has anything to do with the Justice League, but basically the rest of the DC universe. And I was thinking, okay, I've heard a lot of really great things about these. Readers that I trust have recommended it, but I don't really want to get into like this whole larger world of DC for this one book. And that's not what it is at all. Under the Moon is more of like a YA coming of age book that really stands on its own and shows like the development of the character from a young age. And I don't even think that she meets anybody else that we would have heard about in this book.
Yeah, and again, I think those young adult novels or graphic novels that DC is doing now are also great ways to do that because they're out of continuity. They're introducing somewhat familiar characters in a different context or different light. So it's a fun way to sneak superheroes into an audience that maybe wouldn't normally pick up a regular comic from DC.
Yeah, which is exactly me.
I find that with a lot of the Catwoman stories, they, especially in the last 2-3 decades, they have tried to make her more of a standalone character, so you don't necessarily need to know about the rest of the DC universe when reading a lot of Catwoman content, because you're like, she's the sexy heist lady. I can get into that.
There's much more to her than just being a sexy heist lady. Nothing against that, because that's great, but there's much more to the character.
Oh, no, I know. Catwoman is, like, my favorite character, but that's, like, the shortest way of describing what she generally is in the context of the DCU.
Exactly, yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. So, as I mentioned earlier, like, I'm someone that came into comics reading superheroes, specifically DC comics and superheroes, so there's a lot of Marvel stuff that I just ignored over the years, and part of one of the things about doing this show is getting to hear Mike Rappin talk about the X-Men a lot. So I've slowly dipped my toes into X-Men comics. I always assumed I wouldn't like them or be invested in them in a certain degree. Again, I came of age during the 90s comic boom where X-Men were literally everywhere. The arcade game, the cartoon, the movies were on the horizon. The comics were everywhere, and I just never really clicked with the characters that much. Obviously, I think, again, Grant Morrison's take on the characters, which is kind of the first big X-Men stuff I read, was his new X-Men books, which, of course, most X-Men fans don't like. I ended up really liking. And then in the past few years, I've gone back and actually read a lot of the Chris Claremont and John Byrne X-Men stuff from the late 70s, early 80s. And I found myself really enjoying it. It's one of those things where my initial hesitation was I don't really care about these characters, turned into, oh, actually, these characters are really interesting if you have the right angle on them. And then to that extent, I did read all of Jonathan Hickman's House of X, Powers of 10 stuff, and I didn't continue with that past the miniseries itself, but I ended up finding that take on the characters really interesting because it felt fresh and different, as opposed to a lot of my assumption was that all X-Men stories are exactly the same. But it's nice to have a different, fresh take on characters that you think you know.
So for me, I was thinking about this. I have, a few years ago, I read the manga series One Punch Man. Mm-hmm. And it is, if you haven't heard of the series, One Punch Man is, I think it's 5 issues, but like manga style. So each issue is like, 60, 80 pages. I'm just making up numbers, guys. I don't know.
Sure.
But it's a shonen style manga, which are generally marketed towards like teenage boys. And shonen style manga tend to have more like fighting and action. And One Punch Man was described as like, this is a dude who just, he can knock anybody out with one punch. And I'm like, well, I don't really like fighting. And normally when I read manga, it's like the shoujo manga, which is more marketed towards like younger adolescent girls, and everything's very like frilly and sparkly. And this just seems like not my thing. And reading One Punch Man was kind of like experiencing a sort of epiphany of clarity. Like, when you're having like a really chore laden or exercise heavy day, maybe you're hiking up a mountain when you're not physically fit for that, and you just are covered in like dirt and sweat and grime, and all you want to do is take a shower, and the second you step out of that shower, you just feel like you're a new person. That is the experience that reading One Punch Man brought to me. I left that book feeling like I was cleansed. Like the specificity and succinctness of the storytelling had caused me to be reborn in my appreciation of the comic book medium. And if you had told me that going into this story, I would have been like, nah, son, it's all about a dude who just punches people. Where's the fun in that? And then I read it and I was like, oh, I see. I see why this is popular. So that was something that I did not expect to like at all. And then I came out of it being like, I have seen the light.
Yeah, that's an interesting point too, because I'm admittedly read very little, if any, manga. And part of that is that I don't know if it's aesthetics or just something, but the genre seems daunting to me in a way that it shouldn't be. Like, it should be approachable. I should be able to pick something. I mean,
Paul, to be fair, your experience with manga is like Renee, who mostly reads manga and is very committed to it, and Mike, who has decided to read One Piece, which is like 1,000 issues. So,
right? Yeah,
manga can be intimidating.
But the ability or the drive to just try something, knowing that it might not click for you, I think that's what we're talking about for this topic, right? The idea of like pushing yourself out of that comfort zone, saying like, hey, I don't normally like manga, but this sounds appealing. Even if story-wise it might not work for me, I'm going to give it a shot. You might be surprised. And I think that's been tough for me to do with manga, as opposed I've been willing to do that with other genres of comics.
Yeah, most times it is somebody that I trust giving a personal recommendation that pushes me to read something like that. Not to really double dip here, but when the recent minisode that Nick and I did, where I made him read Archie and he made me read Valiant, I genuinely enjoyed Bloodshot Reborn. And the first like 10 pages of that book, I was like, I don't know, Nick, this is like superhero B-level trash. I don't it seems pretty generic, but it wasn't. And I found myself at the end of the first volume being like, I'm going to read more of this, which is not something I would have thought. Like, it's like the whole thing is it's this soldier who just keeps reforming his molecules, and he solves his problems with guns, but he's not the Punisher, kids. And I I think because with Bloodshot Reborn, they were like, all right, this dude, and here's his powers. Plot twist, he doesn't have his powers. And it just made me feel like I could jump right in and know what was going on. And they did enough interesting things with the story where I was like, okay, I would not have picked this up had someone not told me to read it, but I'm glad I have read it and will probably continue to read it.
Yeah, there you go. I think, Kait, you also had some examples of comics that maybe content-wise, in terms of the violence, what didn't seem appealing, but you ended up liking?
Yeah, really recently, actually, for both of these. I'm not really attracted to super violent comics. I can't even remember what the title was at this point, but at one point I had been going through some comics that Mike Rappin had, and I'm like, all of these comics have to be good because Mike likes them. And then one or two of them in particular were just like 50% blood on every panel. So that really turned me off to like any kind of extreme violence in comics. But recently I finally read The Warlords of Appalachia by Philip Kennedy Johnson, and I kept hearing about this book, and it showed up on Hoopla, and I wasn't really sure that I was going to like it because the cover shows a muscular man holding a bow and arrow with burning buildings in the background, and I was like, everything about this is things that I don't like. But I read it, and it turns out that the story actually involves this guy that's just trying to help his family and his neighbors and avoid this fascist government. So it kind of hit close to home in some ways.
Yeah.
Especially because there's a segment of the population in it that's diseased. But I enjoyed the setting, and the very muscular man on the cover is actually, I don't know, he's a good guy that wants to be left alone, and he gets caught in a bad situation. And then some of the supporting characters really tugged at my heartstrings. So that one ended up being something that I liked a lot.
Yeah, interesting.
And then I finally read The Old Guard, which I think you've talked about, Paul. That one's by Greg Rucka and Leandro Fernandez. And I read it to see if I wanted to watch the adaptation. I can't remember if it's a TV or a movie.
It's a
recently.
movie. It should be a show, though. There's more there.
So I was expecting more of like a tough, regimented military based on like the cover and the title, which again shows, there's a weapon right in the middle of the cover. But the characters are all really unique, and all of the characters have different types of relationships with one another that are all very different. Like not just like for a token difference, but they're like, I don't know, thousands of years old, so these relationships go real deep, and I definitely ended up crying a little bit over some of these relationships and what happened to them. And so it was a very different book than I was that I was expecting.
I actually have not read that. I wonder who was the person that recommended it. That's one that I have to add to my list. So I do normally like Greg Rucka, so I will have to check that out.
I wonder who it was then. I could have sworn it was you.
I think there's an interesting subtopic here, which maybe we have to table for another episode, is how much easier Hoopla has made all of this. There's so many books that I normally would not spend money on, but I have read and fall in love with because of Hoopla. So that's maybe the subtext here.
I agree.
An example.
Go on, Paul.
I was going to say an example of that is Gideon Falls by Jeff Lemire and Andrea Sorrentino, which again, Nick made me read for a book versus book episode. And that also helps doing the stuff, having friends recommend stuff and challenge you to read it.
Sensing a theme with Nick making us read stuff we don't want to read.
Exactly. The thing here is that I've never clicked with Jeff Lemire's stuff. It's not that I don't like it, but I've never found it that engaging. Outside of his Essex trilogy series, the early comics he did about growing up in Canada, I absolutely love that trilogy. But most of the stuff he's written, particularly superhero stuff, never clicked for me. But Gideon Falls, I guess Nick knew my love of Twin Peaks enough to know a book that borrows a lot of the dreamlike narrative aspects of David Lynch's Twin Peaks and puts into a comic. It kind of worked for me. It does, again, help that the new volumes show up on Hoopla, and they pop up on my list, and I read them that way, as opposed to tracking down the single issues. So that book was a surprise. I think in Sorrentino's artwork does help again, which is another topic, I think. artwork is so important. I find it easier to read an underwhelming story with amazing artwork as opposed to a great story with underwhelming or off-putting artwork. There's something there to that dynamic to me, but that might be another topic for another show.
Well, what an excellent segue to my next books I was going to talk about, Paul. There's that kind of like 80s, 90s indie action comic book style where it's like kind of rough and sketched out almost.
Yeah.
I got 2 books that fall into that category that, again, were recommended to me by somebody I trusted when it comes to comic books, and I would never in a million years have picked them up. Revenger by Charles Forsman, and Copra by Michel Fife. And so Revenger is a very simple plot, excellent execution. Revenger is about this woman who essentially looks like Grace Jones, who is like, I will, like, if you hire me, I will get revenge on people for you. She is the Revenger. And so the book is like very bloody, gritty, action oriented, but in a way that's like very entertaining and extremely well executed. And if you had just said, like, if I had been like walking by Charles Forsman's table at a Comic-Con and seen his work, I would have walked right by. But because somebody I knew said, read this book, I did. And I was like, oh man, this is awesome. Because I was, judging it by the art.
Yeah. That's interesting because I love Charles Forsman because I read The End of the Fucking World, his book that he did early on, which again was turned into a Netflix series. I love that comic so much. Revenger felt so radically different from that book, but I ended up liking Revenger as well because of his artwork and his cartooning pacing. There's something ineffable about the way he paces action in that book. So it's supposed to look like an 80s action movie, but there's a weirdness to it. I can't exactly explain it, but it's a really striking book visually because of that.
Yeah. And I kind of group in Copra with Revenger because it felt to me like that same kind of like 80s, early 90s, like spare lines, grittiness. Copra is more like if you liked Justice League International or any like offbeat, quirky superhero team books where everyone is just like one bad day away from like murdering their teammates, it's like that kind of thing. And again, like art style and plot wise, I probably wouldn't have picked it up, but like one issue was enough to sell me on like, oh, Michel Fife knows what he's doing, has a very clear vision, he's executing that vision, and it works.
Yeah. That's another one. I was kind of sold immediately as soon as I saw it. That was so visually striking to me, that style. It's Steve Ditko-esque with a bunch of Marshall Rogers style in it, and like that cross-section works for me. And then I remember reading a few issues of Copra and then going and reading the John Ostrander Suicide Squad from the 80s, and then realizing Copra is a straight-up homage to that book. So it kind of clicks all the boxes for me, but I can imagine a lot of people that might not be instantly appealing.
No, it is very Suicide Squad. And again, as Paul said, it's the 80s comic, not the movie.
Right. Yes,
Please
very different.
Continue to forget about the movie.
Go ahead.
So while thinking about this topic, I found it easier actually to think about books that I was told I was supposed to like and didn't actually like. For example, all those lists of best comics and graphic novels that you should read. Like when I was younger, I read Watchmen because everyone said you have to read Watchmen if you're like a real nerd or whatever. And I understand that book is a masterwork. I don't like it. I don't like Watchmen. I said it. I mean,
it's a safe space. You can say that.
I mean, I love the HBO sequel. That was very well done. But like the Watchmen graphic novel, I'm like, I understand this is good. It is not for me.
Yeah, and I think, we hinted at that earlier, the idea of recognizing craft in something, but it might not grab you emotionally or intellectually. I think that's a common thing. Like, I think it might be a topic for another episode, and we have talked about the problems of there being a canonical group of comics that are supposed to be read. Like, that's problematic and not helpful. I will say I read Watchmen when I was 15, and when I was 15, I loved it. And then reading it again, at 25 or 35, it's diminishing returns. But I think that's part of just art in general. You come to it with, different expectations, and when you revisit stuff, it maybe not works for you at that age. So, but again, that might be a bigger topic of books that fail to meet your expectations. So, as for one more example, honestly, the first book I thought of when I was doing this was Scott Pilgrim by Brian Lee O'Malley.
Oh, okay.
Because when I got back into reading comics regularly in around 2007, 2008, that was the new kid on the block. That was the hottest book around, and everyone was saying how great it was. And every sort of example or sample I would see, it was just to look to be about video games. And there's few things in the world I find less interesting than video games. So I was like, that book's probably not for me. The manga influence, the art style didn't look appealing. The video game references went over my head, or it didn't work for me. And then it was years later that I finally went and read it because, I got all the volumes from the library, and I can't say I loved it, but I found it more interesting and nuanced and complex than I had assumed. And I had the exact same experience with the movie as well, which I only saw very, very recently for the first time. So that's a book that, again, I don't think I'll go back and reread it, but at least I can say I took a chance, tried it, and I found it more interesting than I expected to.
I guess, like, when I read that book, I found it enjoyable, but I have not revisited it. And the more I think of the concept, the more I'm like, this dude is just like Archie Andrews. Like, how is this idiot getting all these cute girls? Like, right. It's just so unrealistic to me, because I'm like, man, you're not even trying. Like, we have standards. Hello. And it just was like, oh, a dude wrote this.
The whole idea of a book where the title character, the titular character, the main character and narrator essentially is completely unlikable, that's a really tough sell for me personally. So that's a big hurdle. There's a lot of books where that's a major turnoff, where I kind of stop reading, where it's like, well, if I don't like the character, how am I supposed to be engaged with the story? And I think Brian Lee O'Malley does enough interesting stuff in there, and I do think the comic is more nuanced than the movie, obviously, because it's a lot longer. But yeah, it ended up being surprising to me, given my initial hesitation, because of the art style and the completely unlikable character of Scott Pilgrim.
I saw an amazing tweet earlier this week that was like, if you have ever been compared to Ramona Flowers, you might be entitled to financial compensation.
Yes. Yes, the whole genre of the manic pixie dream girl is also problematic to me. But luckily, again, I think both the comic and the movie, Ramona Flowers, is more complex than maybe you expect on first glance. So, again, I think, does anybody have any other examples they want to shout out before we start to wrap things up here?
Well, I think this is a very appropriate topic for a milestone episode, because what are we talking about if not how we have all learned and grown as humans together on this comic book reading journey?
Yes, good point, Kara. So yeah, I think if nothing else, I'd be curious to hear what our listeners think, if there are any other books that they initially were hesitant about and end up loving, or if they want to yell at us for not liking certain books that we should. That's fine too, I guess. So you all know where to find us. We are all over the internet. You can follow us individually on Twitter. Kate is at Kate L. Fear. Kara is at Kara S. Zam, and I am at Oh Hi Polly. This show is at IRCB Podcast, where we share comic news, art, sass, and a whole lot more.
This show and our many subscriber-only episodes are powered by fans like you on Patreon. Join now at patreon.com/IRCB Podcast. And if you haven't already, please rate and review our show with 5 stars on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and wherever you listen to podcasts.
Join us on Discord at ircbpodcast.com/Discord and make sure to tell a friend or two about the show.
Infinity Shred is the best band in the universe. They also do the music for our show, so thank you to them. Xander is a good friend and a fantastic editor. Thank you for doing this 250 episodes, Xander, plus many more. I want to thank Kate and Kara for joining me today. Thank you, Mike, for letting me sit in the host chair. And until next time, comics are good, and so are you.